So I guess I just want to quickly start with a bit of motivation here. And I'd like to start with the question of why do you present and organize talks? And for me, the answer to that question is to share knowledge and ideas. So to service that, I look at recordings as a way to take those ideas and to reach the maximum audience that you can. So it's nice to have it later for people that are in attendance to review, and it's nice for people who can attend or who are maybe out of town to be able to see your talks and see what's going on here in Edmonton. In terms of the actual talk, my name is Mark Bennett. I'm president at Burma Studio, board member of Dev Edmonton, and you can find me on Twitter or GitHub at Mark Bennett. I have been running meetups for a very long time now. I've been involved in the old Ruby meetup. I've been involved in the JavaScript meetup for quite a while here. And so we've really been focusing on recording some of our talks. And the point of this is to share some of what we've learned. In general, what we're going to do today is go through some things that you should know before you start. We're going to talk about hardware, software. We're going to be focusing on a piece of software called Open Broadcast Studio, which I'll speak to later. But we'll go through some of the settings, sources, how to use scenes in it. I'll talk about some lessons learned over the years. We'll go through some troubleshooting, which you got to see a bit of the live troubleshooting there. And then we'll wrap up. And for the last hour of the workshop, or however long we have, I'd like to kind of sit down with everybody and we can go one at a time through everyone's machines and make sure that you've got OBS and stuff set up there. So let's go. I know that there could be lots of questions both now and after, so I've set up an event recording channel on our Slack. If you're not on there, you can go to devedmonton-invite.heroku app and it'll send you an invite to our Slack. And then once you're on, you can join the event recording channel. I definitely recommend doing that because I will make sure that I'm monitoring that for any new messages or questions. And that way too, you guys can kind of talk amongst yourselves if you have comments and questions during the talk today. We will be stopping at regular intervals for questions. So if you have one, maybe I'll ask you just to hold on for a few minutes, and at the end of each section, we'll kind of stop and talk about those. And this is my first time doing this talk, so I'm hoping to do it a couple more times at least, and I'd really like feedback. This is my first time kind of presenting on the recording setup that I use, and I'm sure there's going to be things that I don't cover or I could cover better. So afterwards, if you have kind of things that you wish I'd done or things that you wish I'd kind of explained differently, definitely let me know. I want to hear it. So before you start recording, there's a bunch of things you have to decide. The first one is whether you want to record or stream. And for those of you that don't know, there's kind of two different ways that you can share these talks. The recording is where you just have the event, you create a file on your laptop, and you upload it later to YouTube. It's nice because it's simple, it's reliable. If there's mistakes or you need to do a second try, you can do that. And you don't need an internet connection. The cons are that there's no remote interaction. So anyone who isn't in the room, they're not going to get a chance to engage with you. Twitch, YouTube, a lot of the other video streaming services have really great tools for having live chats and all that kind of stuff. And also after the event, I find whenever you're dealing with a file that has to be uploaded, it's going to take longer for that content to go live and to share with the community. So if you're really on top of it, you can get it up that night or that weekend, but oftentimes it will sit there for weeks or months before it's uploaded. So just something to keep in mind depending on the content that you're working with. When you're recording, you should definitely set your bitrate as high as you can, and we'll talk about exactly what that means. But basically you want to keep as high a quality as you can and that you have storage on your machine to hold. And don't forget that you will need that time afterwards to upload. So if people are asking when things will go up, if you've recorded a 6 gigabyte video file, it'll probably take you, half a day or something like that to upload it, depending on your internet connection. So don't promise it'll be up an hour after the event if you've got huge files that you need to upload. The other option is streaming. And so streaming is something that we've tried to do in the past. It's great because you can reach a huge audience, content is immediately available, but the cons are that you need a really fast, reliable internet connection. And I've tried at quite a few different venues. So for these kind of things to actually work correctly, you're talking something like fiber, something where, when you do those speed tests, you're regularly getting over 10 megabits per second upstream. but you should definitely be ready to go and do probably a 10-minute stream just to test, because I have found stuff like at home, I will get my SHA speed, we'll say it's 7 megabits up, and I'll get that for about a minute of OBS streaming, and then it'll drop off significantly to the point where it's not usable anymore. So you really need to have a fast internet connection, and mistakes are live. So if people are swearing or if people are messing up, it's going up on the internet, and your only option is to stop the stream and I guess delete it if you want to get rid of it. So this is just an example. So this was a test I did this morning. It said that I was getting 7.5 megs up, and I did for about a minute, and then it dropped to 200 kilobits per second up, so 0.2 megabytes up. YouTube for 1080p streaming, they recommend at least reliably 3 megabytes per second. They recommend about 6, and if you're going to go past 1080p, you're going to need a lot more than that. So, and that's at 30 frames a second. You need to double all those numbers too if you're doing 60 frames a second. So, yeah, and really streaming is hard. It's great, it's awesome if you can do it, but test. I say do 10 minutes at least, and make sure it's actually something that you're doing at the venue. And if it's something where you're doing it over Wi-Fi, the one other catch too is the Wi-Fi will work when no one else is using it. And when the event starts and you have like 100 people on the Wi-Fi with other phones, it will not. So if you're going to stream, try to get a hard connection if you can, or have your own wireless network, anything like that, to make sure that you're not competing for resources. Because even if it does work in advance, it might not work on the day of. The other question is whether you want to do online or offline editing. So what that means is there's kind of two ways that you can take your video and add titles and content and things like that to it. So offline, where you record your event and then record it in something like iMovie or another tool like that afterwards. The pros is that it keeps things really simple during the event, right? There's less things to go wrong, and especially when you're first getting started, it can be nice to kind of have that recording to edit later. But it does require extra work, so expect to give yourself at least kind of the same amount of time as the recording was to edit it, because you'll probably want to watch through all of it. And also depending, if you're working in 1080p, you're going to be needing time for it to process the video and all that kind of stuff. So usually I would assume, like, if I recorded on a Thursday night, videos would not be up until the end of the weekend at the earliest. So leave yourself time to do that. And also you have to learn how to use the editor. So things like iMovie make it pretty easy, but there are still lots of little kind of tricks that you need to learn to be able to work with it properly. So you'll need to leave yourself time to learn an editor. Online is where you go the other way and you use OBS or whatever recording tool you're using to do all of the editing and titles and credits and stuff like that during the recording. So this is what I've moved towards now. I feel like personally I'm confident enough in my understanding of OBS that I can manage this, and it makes it so much easier because at the end you just have a simple video file you can upload to YouTube and then you're done. There's no kind of fussing and things like that. And there's no extra video editors to learn, but because you are using more complex setups in Open Broadcast Studio, you can run into issues where things go wrong. And so as you'll learn, like, things going wrong is what you want to avoid when you're recording talks. So, the other question too is which video service? There are lots of them out there today. So YouTube is by far the largest and most popular. It's the one most people have heard of too. There's others that may be more specifically targeted to the kind of video content that you're producing, depending on what your events are. We'll be using YouTube today. And one of the reasons is because we actually have a YouTube channel that we've set up here for meetups in Edmonton. If you want to, you're more than welcome to put your videos on our channel or promote them through here. You don't have to do anything that we're doing today or to use our equipment. But you may want to, because there's some features that YouTube only enables as your subscriber account goes up. So stuff like the live streaming, stuff like Super Chat. I think that's a decision that you would want to make on, in terms of what's best for your meetup. But we're definitely encouraging people to try to share the channel if we can, because then everyone's kind of subscribers all get together and it kind of raises the profile for everybody. But you need to do what makes sense for you. The other option is if you're doing video games or even some coding. A lot of people will stream now on Twitch. So that's probably the biggest competitor to YouTube. So if you're looking for something that isn't YouTube, that would be a place to check out. There's others too. People do self-branded sites. You can do Vimeo, Facebook Live. I haven't used that one, but for news content and things like that, that's a place you might want to consider. And there's lots of others. So, and the final thing is what screen resolution to use. Depending on your content and your recording equipment and things like that, you might not be able to record at 1080p, or you might want to record at 4K, which is higher than 1080p. We've settled on 1080p as a good in-between. It's going to give you clear enough pictures for showing source code and things like that in your examples, and letting people see what's on your screen if you're working in an IDE. But at the same time, it won't destroy the laptops and things like that and people's internet connections when you're trying to stream. But yes, definitely make sure that you're thinking about this in advance and making decisions, because a lot of your production assets, like your backgrounds and stuff like that, will all need to be made in this size. So changing it can be a big pain. So hardware, there's a couple things. We have here kind of an overview, and I'm not going to go into this too much right now. This is documented. We have a big kind of website where I break down what all these pieces are and how they go together. And after the talk today, we're going to go and kind of look through the setup that we have here. But essentially what we have is the presenter's computer has HDMI coming out of it. And I've got a little marker I can turn. Yeah. So presenter's computer here has HDMI coming out of it and going into a splitter. One of the HDMI goes up to the projector, which is what everyone in attendance will see. The other one comes in through a capture card and is then recorded on the computer using OBS, which is our software. For the audio side, we have a wireless microphone, so you guys can probably see that there on my lapel. It's going to come through, there's a matching wireless receiver, and then it goes into a little USB audio pack, and then that will come in through USB hub and again get recorded on the computer's OBS. And then finally, we have a Logitech Brio webcam that we use for recording the actual video of whoever is speaking. And again, that comes in through the USB hub into the recording computer. So we'll go through this as we kind of look at the hardware setup after, and it'll be detailed in more detail on the website too. In terms of software, we have a couple things that we'll be using today. Actually, why don't I pause there for a second? Are there any questions about that hardware setup? I know this diagram looks kind of confusing, but once you've done it a couple times, you start to kind of remember how things go.
Why not just use the webcam?
So that's a good question. We have, the question was, why don't we just use the webcam mic? And honestly, some of them do have like multiple mics and can pick up a pretty clear signal. But we've definitely found that we can eliminate a lot more background noise, and especially if you're recording here at Startup Edmonton in the kitchen, for example. In this room, it's not as bad, but in the kitchen, there can be a lot of background noises from things like fridges and ACs and stuff like that. So having the microphone physically as close to the speaker can make a big difference in the quality of the sound. If you don't have the microphone hooked up, then you need to use what you can get. But you should definitely be checking the audio through the monitor that you'll set up in OBS later too. So good question, thank you. Any other questions about the hardware?
As for the HDMI splitter, and for Edmonton, there's something kind of, that just like where the OBS would tie in to capture the.
Yeah, so basically the HDMI splitter, it sounds fancy, it's not. It's like a $20 or $25 thing on Amazon. And so all it does is we have an HDMI that comes out of the laptop. From there, it's going to split into the projector, which is what we see here. And then it goes in through a little HDMI to kind of USB capture device. It's called an AVIO. And that's kind of how it shows up on the computer. It'll show up on the computer as one of the webcams. So it actually shows as like the AVIO webcam. Yeah, so it's nice too. The one that we're using doesn't have any drivers for Windows, Mac, or Linux. It just shows up as a generic. But there are other ones too that we've seen that do the same kind of thing. I think Ben had mentioned one that has pass-through, so that you don't even need the splitter, which is nice. So maybe I'll post a link to that if you don't mind.
And as for the screen resolution, 580 or 1920 is like pretty good for it to look on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Normal
Yeah.
That works well.
Yeah, we found that 1080p, most speakers with their default kind of desktop settings will be clear for people watching the screencast. We'll usually ask them to turn up their font size, like not change their resolution, but turn up the font size if they can, for people that are looking at it on the screen. But when you're viewing it at home, it looks fine. We haven't had any problems. Most people wouldn't know that it's not like the total native resolution on their desktop.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep. All right, maybe I'll move on here and we'll take some more questions later. So software. There are a couple of different software we're going to use. Open Broadcaster software, Open Broadcasting Studio, Open Broadcasting software. I've heard it called all of these things. It seems to call itself all of these things in its documentation. I usually just call it OBS, or apparently OBS Studio, which seems redundant. Whenever we talk about OBS, we're talking about this. So just remember, this is where you're going to live most of the time. It's how you'll manage taking all of these different inputs and devices and mixing them together into a video that you can either stream to YouTube or that you can record and upload to YouTube later. So OBS, learn it, you'll need to. Other things, we have a configuration tool that goes along with our HDMI to USB capture device. It's called an AVIO, and so this is the config tool. The biggest thing that this will give you is an ability to check the source that's coming out of the laptop and see what the native resolution is, because you'll need to put that into OBS for it to look without scaling and issues and things like that. It does work on Windows, Mac, and Linux, which is something we've really tried to support for our whole stack. And honestly, you won't be in it too much other than just to check that resolution, but it's useful to do that. The other one, Logitech Brio camera settings. Unfortunately, these are only available on Mac and Windows. So you can use pretty much any webcam you want. So if we can find one that has good camera settings on Linux, we will definitely switch to using that and recommend it. But we haven't done that yet. We haven't found one. So for now, this is what we're using here. It will work on Linux, but it just shows up as a generic webcam. And I don't think it does the 4K, it just does 1080p webcam. But there's lots of things you can change in here. The biggest thing that the camera settings give you is the ability to pan and zoom the actual kind of webcam source in real time in the video. So you can use it to zoom in on your speaker if they're moving around and get a nice tight headshot, which is always good to have in your video. And it's 4K, so you can do that quite a bit without losing too much quality. So, does everyone, just a quick show of hands, does anyone not have all of the software installed on their machine?
I don't.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
As for that, do you have any recommendations for Linux?
I haven't found one yet, to be honest. But if actually anyone here finds a Linux webcam that can do, specifically for me, the thing that I like is the ability to pan and zoom in the video source. That would be great, and we would definitely support that. But yeah. No, it's good. I'm actually probably switching to Linux here in the fall, so yeah, I would be curious to know that too. So let's dive into OBS and setting it up. I'm going to go through this in 3 parts. So the first thing is that I'm going to walk you guys through just the kind of high-level settings. These will apply no matter which scene or sources you're using. You usually just set them up once and then kind of leave them alone unless you're going to be changing your streaming settings or something like that. So if you want to follow along, you'll want to launch OBS. And once it's finished loading up, you'll see a screen sort of like this. And you might be missing scenes here and sources there. They'll be blank. But what you will see is some buttons over here, and specifically the settings button. So when you click on that, you're going to come up with this screen. And in this screen, we're going to change a couple settings that I found useful, specifically for screencasting when you're doing kind of technical talks and things like that. And also to make sure that you get the highest quality upload to YouTube or other video services later. So, on the general one, there's not too much you're going to change. You can take a look at some of these options. The only one that I like to make sure it's doing is checking for updates on startup, because they do have them coming out. But everything else you can leave the way it is. And I can't remember if it's dark theme by default, but I like the dark theme, so that's what I'm going to use in this talk. There is a light one if you prefer light themes. The next place that you have to go is switch your stream and make sure you're picking the streaming service that you're going to use. It defaults to YouTube. You can leave the primary YouTube ingest server. That's basically the server that it's going to upload your video to, but there is a backup one if for some reason that goes down. And then the other thing you need to get is you need to go into your YouTube settings and go to live stream, and then it'll have at the bottom of the live streaming a little key. Basically, you copy that and then you paste it in here, and that's how it knows whose stream is whose when you start streaming. So it's like a 16-digit alphanumeric thing. It's, yeah, just copy and paste it. You won't ever have to set it again. So, and that's all there is for setting up if you want to use YouTube. If you want to use other services like Twitch, you can just pick them from the drop down, and it's pretty similar. They almost always have a little key or something like that you'll put in. This is where it starts to get a little more involved. And so this screen is where we're actually going to be setting the output that we'll use. And so this is the output that it's actually encoding the video file in. So the things that we're going to set here is I usually immediately switch to advanced. There is like a simple setting that'll be on by default. You can try that and see what kind of mileage you get with it. But for screencasting in particular, there's a few things that I do like to change. So the first thing I do is you can leave the audio tracks alone. That just determines which audio devices it's going to record. So leave that to 1. You shouldn't need to change that right now. If you're on Mac, there's a hardware encoder, which it's worth switching to. The Mac hardware encoder, you'll see it go from about 50–60% CPU usage down to about 5 to 10 CPU. So it can make a pretty big difference. There's a similar one for Windows, and there is supposedly one for Linux now that I haven't tried yet. So we're going to be showing the Mac one here just because I know that that's what a lot of the recording things for the Exchange.js meetup are. But we definitely, if you have some experience with the other platforms, we would like to hear from you. So yeah, so take a look at those, try the different encoders, see what they do to your CPU usage when you're recording, and I'll show you where to find that later. So for this one, pick hardware, and then down here, you want to set your bitrate. You want to set your bitrate to at least 12 megabits per second if you're going to be recording. And so that'll make sure that it has a lot of bandwidth to capture any details in the video and the talk that you're doing. The other thing that you want to set here, and this one will be 0 by default, so you'll definitely want to change it, is the keyframe interval. And so basically what this says is every second it's going to almost take like a snapshot of the whole screen and drop it into the video stream. And so that gives you two things. One, it makes sure that if people are scrolling around a lot in their source code, that it's regularly kind of having a nice crisp shot to work from. But also later on, when you're looking at the video, say before you upload to YouTube, or when you're trying to upload it to YouTube, having those keyframes means that you can scrub and move through the video a lot faster. Without those, it basically has to kind of render from the start to exactly where you've clicked on. And that can be a problem on not even slower computers, on fast computers without the keyframes. And if you have those, YouTube seems able to start processing while the upload is still happening too. So you can cut down on your processing time quite a bit too. The last thing too is there's these profiles here. It's like baseline, medium, high. I haven't found it makes a huge difference, but I always set it to high because that's what YouTube recommends. And it seems to have produced pretty good quality. So I would switch that to high as well. This will work with FFmpeg too. So there's like an FFmpeg encoder that works everywhere, which is nice. It is the one that uses your CPU quite a bit more. But if you have a fast CPU, it might not be a problem to use that too. And that's probably what you would start using on Linux, I think. The other thing that we'll do is now, still on the output screen, there's tabs where we were just on the streaming one. The recording is the other one that you'll want to set. And the big thing that you're just setting here is where the recordings go. So by default, they go to the movies folder. That's fine. I usually leave them there. You'll want to change the recording format though, because by default, it records in Flash. And if you're going to edit it at all, that's not going to work. The other options are things like MP4 or MOV. I have tried to use MP4 in the past. There can be issues with MP4 files getting corrupt if OBS ever crashes though. And a lot of editors don't like to work with MP4, or if they do, the editors crash. So I've found that I don't have good results with MP4. And for the recording itself, I usually use MOV on Mac because it's easy to edit in iMovie. But you might want to look, if you are going to be doing editing, at your editor and pick something that is easy to work with that. The other thing that you see down here too is it shows the audio tracks. So again, basically, we're going to have audio tracks that are configured to record the different audio sources in our talk. And just leave that set to 1 for now, but just know that if you had, maybe mics coming in from the audience and stuff that you wanted to be able to dynamically mix, you might have different audio tracks, and you would want to make sure that you check off all the audio tracks that you want in the final recording there, otherwise they'll be missing. So, but honestly, don't play with it unless you're like ready to deal with that extra complexity. Just make sure it's checked. The other thing too, the encoder, if you can, I always set it to use the same one as the stream encoder. It's capable of running and encoding the video into 2 different encodings, like one for streaming and one for recording. So you could have a stream where you're also recording it in like a different quality, like a higher quality maybe, and streaming a lower quality. But unless you're planning on getting into some more complex setups like that and have a computer that can handle doing that, I almost always use it as the same as the stream encoder. So it also just makes it easier. There's less settings to deal with. So coming over here, there's a separate audio tab. The only nice thing here is, so this is where you sort of define the tracks. I would leave the bitrate at 160. That's the default. I've never had a reason to change it. You can give them names sometimes. So if you do have multiple tracks, it can be nice to have like, speaker, audience, background sound, or something like that. But especially when you're starting here, I would just leave these alone. And the replay buffer is, you can basically have something where if you're worried about people swearing, or you want to be able to rebroadcast the last 5 seconds for a sports match or something, you can use the replay buffer to do that. Again, for technical talks and things, I've never found that something we've had to use, but you can experiment with that if you need to. So moving on, the audio, actually, one sec, let's take questions here. I know that was a lot I just covered there. So why don't we quickly see if there's any questions that people have.
You're talking a bit about like post-processing iMovie.
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's just recording kind of the input streams, like it's not recording like the raw sources.
No. Yeah, so you'll get like at the end of this in the movies folder, you'll have a single file. So all of the audio sources will be mixed down into like a mono or stereo channel. There are some tools that you can use if you have surround sound, for example, because you can record in surround sound on this. You can take all of the separate audio tracks and use like FFmpeg to split them out into separate audio files if you want to. I have had to do that once to fix mixing that really got messed up once, but I can't emphasize enough, if you can avoid using audio tracks and keep your setup really simple, it's almost always worthwhile doing that.
And then the keyframes. So I'm guessing it's probably a trade-off of like recording size and maybe like how much.
I haven't actually done any testing with it to see like how much you're adding by doing the keyframes. But honestly, the files that I record, like a big 45-minute talk is maybe 2 to 3 gigs, and most people have hundreds of gigs free on their computers. So, and then by the time it's up on YouTube, I don't know, I'm sure they deal with the bandwidth and stuff, but I haven't had any issues with dealing with the bandwidth. So usually I've found for the performance gains, having the keyframes there, it keeps the video clear. It's kind of like a backup if you picked the wrong encoding settings. Having those nice crisp shots every second just kind of clears things up. Because there's nothing worse than like someone scrolling through a bunch of source code and it just being a blurry mess while they're talking and like pointing at something that you can't see. So
you find that
yeah, exactly. If you're just doing like the actual source, I would keep the keyframes at 1 per second, and you can do things like drop the bitrate quite a bit, because you don't need a lot of bandwidth just to show text on like a plain background. But we like to have the presenter showing, so we need bandwidth for that. So basically, the more complicated and the more motion and kind of gradients and things that aren't just a simple color on a simple color, the more bandwidth you're going to want so that it's able to represent it properly. So we also usually record in 60 frames a second, and for a screencast where there's no picture of like the person speaking, for example, you probably don't need that. You could get away with 30 or even 15 frames per second if bandwidth and something that was an issue. So yeah. Yeah, those are some good things if you are just doing a technical like text only screencast, you can definitely cut your bandwidth down a lot.
As well, have you used FFmpeg as your encoder, or is that like you said that it's like really so,
yeah.
How to use a hardware encoder that's available, and if not, then use FFmpeg kind of thing?
Yeah, so the question is basically, would I use FFmpeg or a hardware encoder, and like when? So it defaults, I think, to use, they call it software, and if you look under the advanced settings, then it's actually FFmpeg by default. And so when I do that on this laptop, I was getting about 60% CPU usage with the same scenes and the same sources. And when I switched to the hardware one, depending on which scene it is and like how much is going on, it's usually between 6 and about 15% CPU usage. So like quite a bit lower. And when I was getting anything above 50% CPU, I'm always starting to get nervous that I could see dropped frames or things like that. So you're gonna have to play with that, to be honest. And there actually is a tool in OBS where it'll try some different encoders for you with different settings to see what your computer can handle. I found that it told me to use the software one because my computer could handle the software one, but I liked having the extra headroom of the hardware encoder, and the hardware encoder worked pretty well. Yep. Yeah, but you have to, honestly, so much of this stuff, you almost just have to try it and kind of see what performance you're getting. Okay, so I'm gonna move on now to audio. There wasn't too much to change in this one. The big things that I always do though is there's a channels option where by default it's stereo. That's where you can bump your recording up to do surround sound if you want, but you can also bump it down to mono. And this is something I highly recommend doing. Otherwise, when you're watching it on YouTube or something, you'll be really confused because the speaker will always be like to one side or the other. And if you want them just to be in the middle, set it to mono, then it's easy. There's nothing to mess up that way. And usually if you look at technical talks, that's almost always what they do. So unless it's like an interview situation where you want to have the interviewer on one side and the speaker on the other. But if you're getting to that point, then I'm assuming you'll have a pretty solid grasp of OBS and like audio setup anyway. So yeah, mono unless you're ready to take on the dragons. The other thing too is there's a set of kind of the default devices that are going to be added and kind of show up in every scene. They'll show up in the mixer. You lose a lot of control when you do that. Like you can't add filters and other kind of things. So I always just turn those all off. Then there's no kind of questions about, oh, where did this like magic device come from and why am I seeing it in my mixer when I haven't set it up? I just disable those right across the board, and then I can add them one by one to the scenes that I care about. So any questions about that? No. Okay. We'll explain the mixer and stuff in a minute here. Oh, the other thing too is if you don't do that, you can't have scenes that don't have that audio in it. And so for things like the titles and the credits, when I'm doing my online editing, I like to have it completely silent except for like background music or something. And if those default ones are enabled, you can't do that. Video, so this is now more where instead of like thinking about files and encoders, it's looking more at just kind of the canvas, like the actual screen that you're drawing on. So you do two things here. You set a base resolution, which is what you're going to be working with in OBS when you're dragging things around and placing them on the video. And then there's the output, which is what is actually going to get written to the file. And then there's a downscale filter. So for these, I pretty much always just set them all to 1080p, like the 1920 by 1080. And for the downscale filter, I find the default, it's a lower performing kind of sharpening algorithm that doesn't use as much CPU. I do find for the technical talks, it's worth bumping that up so that it does sample a few more positions and give you ideally clearer text and things like that. So if your computer can handle it, set this to the most samples that you can, basically in the highest quality algorithm. And if you have the space on your hard drive and the CPU to handle it, I also always record in 60 frames per second. When people are streaming on YouTube, it'll automatically reduce that for computers that can't handle 60 frames per second. But just having that in your archives is nice for later. And I do notice it makes things like scrolling look crisper. So, and that is it for the settings. Were there any other questions before I move on to actually setting up some scenes and some sources? Okay, so let's keep going. So those, hopefully once you've got them set up, you won't be playing with that too much. The stuff that you're really going to be in is in the scenes. So what is a scene? So a scene in OBS is basically a collection of sources, and those sources are arranged in a layout. So you'll see in OBS that down at the bottom left, you have a list of scenes. You can have as many as you want. I usually, on a normal project, have maybe 4 to 6, depending. And then when you click on a scene, you'll see right next to it, there's a list of sources. And those sources are going to be the different components that you're going to see in the video or hear in the video. So yeah, an audio or video component is a source. So we're going to start with the sources first, just so that you guys have a sense of what those are. And then we'll build those up into some scenes. So the easiest way to go and add a source is to pick a scene, and then there's a little plus down at the bottom, and it'll pull up this whole long list. And there's actually quite a few different source types. Some of these will vary by your operating system, but about 90% of them will be the same. And we'll go through a few of these today, but I encourage you play with all of them. There's some really neat ones in here. So the main one that we'll start with is the presenter microphone. So if you go add and click on audio input capture, it'll come up with this. It'll list the devices on your computer. Normally I have the whatever kind of USB hub or USB audio capture device that I'm using. I have that also set as the default in my system settings. So I'll often just leave it on default here. But you can also just click and get a list of the devices and pick from that. And then that's it. The audio device is added. But there are a few things you probably want to do after it. So one of them is adding audio filters. It's a simple step that you usually have to do once. You should check it pretty regularly, but you only have to set it up once. So what you do is you select the mic, and when you right click on it, in the pop-up that comes up, there's an option for filters. And then these are the filters that I pretty much always add, and in this order. I add a noise suppression one, which basically just goes and reduces like low frequency noises and things like that. You add a noise gate, which basically says if the volume isn't below a certain level, then just silent, or isn't above a certain level, and then just silence everything. So it just kind of takes it and makes it so that if no one is speaking, it goes to actual silent rather than just kind of being quiet with a background hum. And then the last one I have is a gain filter. And that one just lets you kind of tweak the volume a little bit so that you can make sure it's at a level that sounds good in the recording. The other things you might want to look at, and I haven't looked at this, but I've heard that other software offers ways to normalize the volume too. So you might want to consider looking at that. And if I find some information about that, maybe I'll post that for OBS. But it sounds like there is other software where you can kind of say this is a normal volume that I want, and then it'll try to keep that as speakers move mics and things like that, because sometimes they hold them closer or further. The other thing too is you should get familiar with the advanced audio properties. This is where you set up the monitoring and a couple other things. So you can get to it by either hitting the gear in the mixer beside an audio source, or going up to edit and advanced audio properties. When it pops up, you're actually going to see all the audio sources in your project listed here. For this project, I only have the presenter mic, but sometimes if you have an audience mic or something like that, you would see them all listed here. You can set a universal volume. You can down mix it to mono. So along with setting the whole recording to mono, I like to set the individual sources to mono too, just so that they'll kind of be centered in the recording. If you are doing stereo, you can pan that source left and right. So you can use that to kind of position them if you wanted to have an interviewer, say, on the left and the presenter on the right. The other thing too, and this is a really important one, is the sync offset. What'll happen is when you first start recording video and recording audio, especially if they're not coming from the same device, you'll find that they can be out of sync. And I don't know about you guys, but there's nothing more annoying to me than like watching a video where their lips are not moving along with what they're saying. And so this little tiny thing in the advanced option is how you fix that. So before you start a talk, you should be going and just ask them to make sounds like, get them to talk, get them to say things that have sharp consonants and sharp sounds in them. Maybe get them to clap. whatever you need to do so that you can make sure that in that recording, those are in sync. The other thing too, and this goes hand in hand with getting that audio sync, is monitoring. So by default, all of your audio sources will be set to monitor off. What you can do here is you can pick it so that when the monitor is off, your computer is not going to have any sound coming out of it from OBS. When you turn monitoring on, whatever OBS is recording, it'll put out through your computer. So if you plug in headphones, you'll be able to hear what is going to be recorded in the actual recording. And it's really, I think, important to do that. Like, headphones are the missing recording equipment that you should always have with you, because that way you can listen and hear what is going to be recorded and what people that are maybe listening to your live stream are hearing. So I usually set it to, there's an option for both where it records and lets you monitor. You can also set it so that you're monitor only. Be really careful with that setting, because if you set it to that, it is not going to get recorded. I can't emphasize this enough. You do not want to have it on that 99.99% of the time. I wish there was like a warning when you picked it, because it will sound like it's recording, and unless you go and check the file, it is not going to be there. So make sure it's either monitor off or both, but rarely do you want monitor only. And finally, one other thing too is I've spoken a couple times about audio tracks. These little track checkboxes will be checked by default. Again, leave them alone unless you really know what you're doing. But if you did want to have audio sources that were only in like track 1 or only in track 2, you use these little checkboxes to figure out which tracks they should be in. So, and they can be in as many or as few as you want. But again, that would just be for a more advanced setup later. Okay, so any questions about all that audio setup? I know that there can be quite a bit in it. Good quality audio makes such a difference in a recording, and it's one of the big things that you can tell, people have taken some time to do and make it stand out. Any questions about filters or advanced audio settings or any of that kind of stuff? Nope. Okay, let's keep moving. So the other one that you'll want to set up pretty quickly is the presenter camera. So we set this up as a video capture device. It's down here near the bottom. Pretty similar. You're going to come in. That's me waving. And all you do, you pick your device. Most of them are going to have a preset that'll come up. That's like the resolution that it's getting out of the camera. That's all you need. You'll be good to go. If you don't see a picture here, there's two things you should do. You should make sure that you toggle the device. So usually I switch between devices. Sometimes if you've just restarted OBS, it seems to get stuck on the old device. And so switching, like toggling between devices, can fix that. If that doesn't, you can also uncheck that use preset option, and it'll give you a lot more options for things like resolutions and frame rates, and then you can kind of manually match your device. So you shouldn't have to do that. In my experience, you do sometimes have to do that. So if you're not seeing it, change device, try not using a preset and setting it to something that you know is meant to work. The other thing too is, just like there's audio filters, there are video filters, and video filters are so much fun. There's so many things you can do with them. They don't actually seem to have as much CPU load as I assumed they would. But like very basic things, you can use cropping and padding to maybe take a widescreen video and make it into a square, which is what I do in some of mine. But there's lots of other things. You can do chroma key, which is where you have a green screen behind someone, and you can literally just go to a photography store and buy a roll of green paper for 20 bucks and put that up behind people if you want to have the floating head rather than like, the brick wall or something that you see behind me right now. Some webcams too will do that automatically for you. Apparently the Logitech one on Windows will do that, but it doesn't do that on Mac or Linux, so we don't use it. There's lots of other things too. You can do sharpening, you can do like just adjusting brightness and things like that. You can make people look like the Hulk and look green, whatever you want there. So play with that a little bit. I was really surprised, and I had not used those for a long time, and I wish I'd started using them earlier. Other things, text sources. So these are a little funky. I'm going to walk through doing it on the Mac. On Windows, you have a lot more options, but I understand on Linux it's pretty similar to what we deal with on Mac here, where you're missing a lot of normal features. So this is what, when you add a text source, it's just going to put text on top of whatever graphics you're showing. And so down here, you pick your font. It doesn't let you do like rich text where you can have like this word is bold and then this word is like regular and italic. So anytime you change the font at all, you have to have a new text source. And it doesn't let you pick a color, which is annoying. But I figured out a trick a while ago. You can render the layer and then you can do a color shifting like video filter on it to change it to whatever color you want. So the only way whenever you see color text or like text that is not black basically is that I've shifted the color in the video. Because you'll see in some of my slides like it's black text and white text. I don't think that's a problem on Windows either. Windows jerks seem to have a lot more support because I think there's a lot of gamers on Windows. But yeah, there are ways to work around it. And once you get it set up, it's not a big deal. The other cool thing that I wanted to point out here is you can read the text from a file rather than typing it in. And it can actually work with files where the content is being updated. So if you have like an IRC chat or something like that, if you can get it to output or cat to a file, then you can say, show me like the last 3 lines as a little chat box down at the bottom. So you can have kind of real-time chat in your video. There's other ways to do that too, but that's kind of the more hacker's way. And the other cool thing that I wanted to show, because when I saw this, I was like, no way, is you can do a video filter where it does a scroll on the text. So if you have a big long line of text, you can do like a little ticker and you can put a scroll thing on it where it'll basically, let's say you have text that's this long, your screen is here, then it'll render this part of the text on the screen. But when you put a scroll thing on it, it actually kind of starts to slide across the bottom of the screen like a ticker. And so if you put some graphics with that, it can look really professional, like a news channel or something. So yes, lots of things you can do with filters, lots more than I would expect. Other really simple things, you can do image layers or image slideshows too. Basically, they're what they sound like. You go, you pick an image, usually a PNG is what I use, and then it'll superimpose it into your scene. It does support transparency too, and like the full kind of gradient of transparency, so it doesn't have to be just transparent or not. So you can use that to do a lot of the graphics and stuff that you would see like in a video feed from a TV channel. Yeah, and there's lots of other sources. I'm not going to go through all the other ones right now. Those are all the ones that you would really need to do any of the layouts that we'll deal with today and that I've used for all of my talks. But there's things like web pages. You can have like a web page and embed it as a source and kind of position it where you want. People I've seen will use that to do live chats and things like that. You can tell it to capture the entire desktop, which can be useful if you're doing a tutorial from your computer and streaming. You can also tell it to capture specific windows, things like that. And depending on your operating system, it has a couple different ways to do that because there's certain things like some games don't like people capturing video of them. So you have to work around it a bit. So there's different ways to capture the video. But yes, play with those sources. I'm sure you guys will come up with a lot more creative things than I have. Okay, so we're just about ready to move on to scenes. I just want to ask, that was a lot of ground with all those sources. Does anyone have any questions about those? Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
Thumbs up.
Oh, thumbs up. Okay, we're good. All right, okay, so let's carry on. So scenes basically take all those sources and let you put them together. So I'm just going to go through a couple common scenes here. So this is the one that you'll see for like 90% of the time in 90% of the talks. I like to call it the branded presenter desktop and camera because it's really like creative with names. When you have a lot of scenes, it's good to have like clear names that explain what they are. So this is the one that you'll see. It's the standard one. Most of the screen is devoted to whatever the presenter is showing from their computer. But then we'll have a smaller section where we can see them, and we have some branding just so people know what they're watching. You can have more advanced branding. You could have your ticker here or things like that if you wanted. But this one is pretty simple to set up. So here you can see I've got my scene list on the left, and then on the right in the sources, I have the presenter's desktop. I have the presenter, which is their video. I have an image layer, which is the kind of background that you see, and then the mic. And so one of the important things that I'll point out here is in all of these scenes, because I turned off the default audios, you have to add the audio yourself. So it gives you the option of having scenes that don't have any audio, which you might want. But if you don't add it in, when you switch to that scene, the audio will go silent and it will not be recording. So make sure that you have the audio in them. You'll see it if you look, if you guys have OBS open right now, you'll see at the bottom right is a mixer. where it shows you kind of levels and some things like that coming in for whatever audio devices are in your current scene, or the default ones if those are on. And so you can look at that, and if you don't see anything moving and you don't see anything in there, just remember there's nothing in the mixer and there's no movement. There's not going to be anything in your recording. So other common scenes, this is the presenter desktop. So this is when they're doing something like here they were using the Chrome debugger. And even you can see here on this slide, it's hard to see because there's lots of text, lots of small text. So you want to be able to just get rid of everything else and have that full screen view. So this is a very simple scene to set up. Basically, you drop everything else, and when you put in the presenter desktop, you just resize it so it takes up the whole screen. It's pretty simple. And make sure to leave your mic in there, otherwise you won't hear what they're saying. Finally, we have the presenter camera. So this one is usually what you see at the end of a talk when people are taking questions, when you're just kind of discussing. And basically, it's almost the same as the desktop, but instead of doing the desktop, you have the cam, and it's zoomed big. One thing I will say is if you are doing funky things like cropping and putting special filters on your camera, that will apply to all of the scenes that source is added to. But you can have two sources that use the same device. So make sure if you're going to be wanting your camera to fill the whole screen on this one, that you set it up as a secondary source, like a second source. That's why this one is called presenter full screen, and I had another one for presenter, because if you go back here, yeah, see, this one is called presenter square. It's the same, it's two separate sources using the same device, and the only difference is one of them is cropped and one of them is not. Because like here you can see this is not cropped to be a square, it's filling the whole screen. The other things too is, like down here I added information about the speaker and their handle on Twitter. Sometimes that can be useful if you're taking questions and things, or people just forget names. It can be a bit of a hassle to set up, because if you have multiple speakers, it's not something that I recommend live editing or even editing right before. So I usually would then have like two separate scenes with those graphics already set up, where they both have the same microphone and the same webcam, but different titles and things like that. So I'll show you guys here at the end, but basically like for the Exchange.js one, I have two title slides with the presenters' names and talk titles, and then two kind of presenter full screen with their name and whatever information about them. All right, so any questions about those scenes and setting those up? I know it's going to get a little more complicated there.
Yeah, I'm assuming, I mean, it's more of a question of like, how, of like how to kind of set it up for.
Yeah, and like.
So I'm just like wondering about that.
Yeah. Honestly, like I will say is that you will probably start with the branded one. You might add like the full screen ones after that, and then move into doing like ones with speaker names and titles and stuff after that. So I would start, if you did just one scene, I would keep it as simple as possible and just do that branded one to start, because you can leave that up there 99% of the time and just ask speakers to increase their text size and things like that.
And as for like trench, like, and maybe this is like trying to get too early, but like trench, I think normally what we like a big, like, this is your talk, this is what it is, kind of like how they make it look at Python, and then just like going.
So transitioning is one thing that I don't like how OBS does. So you're kind of just asking like what the options are for transitioning?
Yeah.
Yeah, so right now you have like the basics like cross dissolve and cross fade and things like that, and you can set a timing on that. I wish that you could do something where you could trigger a video or something that would kind of be imposed on top of it. So it would be like a sweeping little blocks or something. It would kind of sweep between the two scenes. I think that's something you would have to do in post-production rather than doing live in OBS. But you can do things like adjust the transition speed and like the basic style of it. So I've played with that a little bit. Usually I have it, I think it's like a half a second transition, feels pretty visible. Yeah.
Star wipes though.
Yeah, like no, your star wipes are out for now, but one day I'm sure they're working on it somewhere. Okay, so I'll keep on carrying on. Ben, can you just confirm how we're doing for time? It should say in the bottom right. 55. Okay, so I'm going to try to burn through this last bit pretty quickly. So best practices, don't change OBS scenes or settings while you're recording. Every time I do this, I regret it. It's never gone well. Always have this set up in advance, and despite how cool it would be or how you could just make this one change, don't do it. It's going to crash. It's not going to show up. Something's going to break. Don't do it. So just get it done right before, and then leave it and make a note to fix it in the next recording. And this kind of goes hand in hand with that. The worst thing that you could happen is have OBS or something in your setup crash while a speaker is talking. Really, I feel like we should always give deference to the people that have made an effort to come out and see an event and the speaker and not interrupt them. And so if you are at the point where you feel you need to interrupt because of a technical issue, it should be a really good reason that the speaker and the audience will appreciate. And if you can't come up with that reason, even if it feels like you could fix it or something like that, don't interrupt. It's just not something that's cool to do. And keep it simple, especially when you're first starting. I can't emphasize enough, don't try to do fancy things. I still have ambitions of like rendering real time like labels and stuff, and like basically taking like OBS and putting it on the projector instead of the speaker slides, and it just has not gone well. Unless you're the kind of person that is doing this all the time and it's 100% rock solid your setup, I would say it's not worth the hassle. People watching the video aren't going to care, and the simpler you can keep it, the more you can kind of keep the presentation out of the way of the content, the more people are going to appreciate it later. So, questions about any of that?
Have you tried doing the side-by-side?
The studio mode? Yeah. So there's in OBS, the question is if I've tried the studio mode in OBS. So for those of you that don't know, in OBS there's the normal view and there's the studio view, which you can use when you want to have a couple scenes up at once and kind of prepare a scene on the left, and then when you're ready you can hit transition and it replaces the scene on the right. And it works really well for things like timing that transition between scenes. And I think if you were producing like a sports show or something like that where maybe you had multiple cameras that you were cutting between, it would make a lot more sense. But I found for me when I first started using OBS, what I thought is like, oh, I can edit the scene that's about to come up next and tweak stuff and edit people's names, and it always caused problems. So for me, the only thing I would recommend using the studio mode for is for times when you need to have like a preview of the next scene up, because there's some kind of like timing critical thing that you need to do that transition at a certain time. Otherwise, leave it alone. And you can just click on the scenes to switch between them. It seemed to me too that if there was any part of OBS that was less stable and caused more crashes, it was the studio mode for whatever reason. Maybe it's just not as used, and so like you encounter more bugs. But yeah, I would say keep it to the normal view as much as you can.
General question on like, example, if you were screen casting, how simple would it be to kind of like have your green screen in your background set up, like just to have it so that it is kind of a floating head? Is it a pretty simple type of like setup? For sure. The biggest thing I would say is if you're trying to do like a simple setup where you're recording yourself at home, or something where you're recording kind of on the computer that you're also using for the demo. We didn't go through it today, but there's in the preferences a whole whack of hotkeys for everything, like for triggering transitions between scenes, for selecting specific scenes and stuff like that. And so what I would do if you're recording on the same computer is set those up, because if you are in OBS and let's say you're capturing your display, you end up with that weird like hall of mirrors view at the start of your videos that you have to edit out, where you can see like OBS is reflected inside OBS is inside OBS, but you can just use hotkeys to start and stop the recordings otherwise.
So yeah, learn the hotkeys if you're doing that is a big thing. And there's no, technically, like, there's no constraints doing that other than CPU, I guess. All right. Any other questions?
You want feedback on the video or off video?
Yeah, why don't we do it afterwards? I wouldn't mind maybe like an email would actually be really good because then I can kind of write it down and make sure I get it all. Troubleshooting, I want to quickly talk about this because there's some weird gotchas and these do come up. So one of the ones that you see, and you guys actually saw a bit of this today if you were here right at the start, you'll see, and it can be hard to tell maybe in the video here, but like there, the word cache, like here around the C and the A, you can see there's a lot of steps and kind of artifacts from scaling. This will happen a lot when a speaker has maybe a laptop that's outputting at a weird resolution or something in terms of the settings coming out of the computer and going in to the HDMI capture are at a different resolution than what OBS is expecting. So when this comes up, the best thing to do is go and pull open the config tools that go with the AVIO, check the resolution that you're getting off the device, and then restart OBS is the next thing I would say. Go find the device in OBS, like find the presenter's desktop, and check that the resolution that it's showing for that device matches what the config settings are saying. If that doesn't fix it, which usually it does, but if that doesn't fix it, go and open your settings for OBS, go to the video and check your scaling. Make sure you're doing like the 32 sampling there and that you have a keyframe every second. If that doesn't work, try restarting again. And at that point, you're kind of surpassed my troubleshooting knowledge with this slide, and I would say go and get some help. The other thing too, background noise. The simplest thing is go somewhere quieter. Check before you actually do your final recording what it sounds like on the monitor, and if you're getting a lot of background noise, consider going somewhere else. If you can, use our lapel mic or get a lapel mic. They're not that expensive. You can get ones that plug into your smartphone if you want to record that way. Set up filters on the audio source in OBS. And this actually, I have resources at the end of this talk, but this is a link to a really good article on going through and setting those up and kind of tweaking them to make sure you know that you've got them. And finally, the last thing you can do is things like iMovie do actually have pretty solid background noise removal. So you can also do that and tell it to, key in on voices and try to remove the other noises. It won't fix it 100%, but if you do these 4 things, you'll notice a big difference in the quality of audio in your talks.
Just one gotcha around, or if you're doing it at home, and, if you use your computer as a microphone, there's a good chance that because you're running OBS, that you can ramp up, that fan noise is actually getting a microphone.
Yeah. So
use a second mic.
Yeah, so that's a great tip actually. So Ben was saying that if you're recording at home and using the built-in mic on your laptop, I would say don't. It's a good place to start if you can avoid it. But yeah, if you are, be prepared to get like the background fan noises and things like that, because even if you can't hear them, they can actually vibrate in the case and stuff like that, and so you'll hear sounds from the computer that you won't even hear in the room.
How much does like a solid microphone go for? That you would recommend?
If you want to get one of these, like you can get ones that plug into the headphone jack, the lapel mics, for like $15 and like less. They're super cheap. Yeah, so like if you were recording, I would say get one of these, or you can get there's USB Yeti mics. They're a bit more. They're gonna maybe run you $100, sometimes $2, depending which one you get. They're really good, but again, like unless you're really seriously getting into like screencasting and podcasting and stuff, you probably don't need that. Something like this would be enough.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so wrapping up here. Again, we are trying to set up a recording channel on Slack. So if you need help, it's a go there. We've got lots of resources. I'm not going to go through all these, but I'll share these later. The ones I'll point out is we have a GitHub repo where I'm trying to capture all of the information about the recording setups so that other people can have that there in kind of written form as well. So that's where we'll document some more of the hardware and things like that too, and have links to different HDMI capture things and stuff. There's a couple really good introductory articles here, and YouTube has a Creator Academy, which I didn't know about until recently. It's pretty heavily targeted towards like monetizing your channel, which I'm not as keen on, but it does have a couple interesting technical things too. So that's an option. And there's a whole ton of other things. I won't go through these. And that's it. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to OBS. It's been a great application. I really appreciate their commitment to being cross-platform and open source, which I like. And I wish I knew their proper name, but I appreciate all the hard work that they put in. And if you're a C++ dev who wants to help out, I know they're always looking for help. They're on GitHub. The Dev Edmonton Society Exchange.js meetup I wanted to thank, because over the last 2 years, they've put up with me learning a lot about this and dealing with a lot of recorded talks and kind of technical issues. So thank you to them, and thank you to everyone that came out today. So I appreciate it. And any final questions? I think I've answered a lot. Alan?
What alternative webcams were you looking at?
For a long time, we had an older Logitech model that worked pretty well, to be honest. The biggest reason that we have been using the Logitech Brio is because it has good support when you have like a speaker that's in shadow and they're speaking beside or in front of another bright light source. I think they called it UHD or HDR or something like that. But I mean, any webcam could work. I'd say get one that, if you can, does 60 frames per second. I do like the 4K because we can do the digital zoom on it, but this is certainly not the only one that does that. And make sure you go, and if you're going to be recording in a space, try to get in there in advance and like test out your equipment so that you have a webcam that doesn't do low light very well or doesn't do high contrast very well, and then you can make kind of decisions accordingly. So a lot of it just comes down to doing practice runs, lots and lots of practice runs. All right, any other questions? All right, I think we'll wrap. Thank you. If you have any feedback, just send me a message after. All right.